Hi, I'm Kat, and today I have for you a word in Romanian, a true crime case, and I will also be doing my makeup at the same time. So, the word in Romanian for today is foc. Foc. F-O-C. Foc. Well done, guys, you just said fire. It was Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1945, when a fire destroyed the Sodder home in Fayetteville, West Virginia, the US. George Sodder, his wife Jenny, and 9 of their 10 children were living in the house at the time. George Sodder, who was born Giorgio Soddu in Sardinia, Italy in 1895, immigrated to the United States 13 years later with an older brother who went back home as soon as both of them cleared customs at Ellis Island. George eventually found work on the railroads in Pennsylvania, carrying water and other supplies to workers, and after a few years he had more of a permanent job as a driver in Smithers, West Virginia. Afterwards, he started his own trucking company, at first hauling field dirt to construction sites and then coal, which was mined in the area. Jenny Cipriani, a storekeeper's daughter in Smithers, had also immigrated from Italy in her childhood. She later became George's wife. They settled outside nearby Fayetteville, which had a large population of Italian immigrants, and they lived in a two-story timber frame house 2 miles or 3.2 kilometers north of town. In 1923, they welcomed the first of their 10 children. George's business actually went very well. It was successful and the family became one of the most respected middle-class families around. But the thing is, George had strong opinions about a lot of subjects and he wasn't exactly shy to express these opinions, which would sometimes lead to estranging people. In particular, his opposition to the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini led to some strong arguments with other members of the immigrant community. The last of the Sodder children, Sylvia, was born in 1943. By that point, their second oldest son, Joe, left home to serve in the military during World War II. The next year, Mussolini was executed. However, George's criticism of him left some really hard feelings. In October 1945, a visiting life insurance salesman, after he was rejected, warned George that his house would go up in smoke and his children are going to be destroyed because of the dirty remarks George was making about Mussolini. Which kind of, sounds like a threat, right? Especially considering what will happen next. Another visitor to the house, who was looking for work, went around the back of the house and warned George that a pair of fuse boxes would cause a fire someday. George was actually quite surprised by what this man was saying, especially because he just had the house rewired when an electric stove was installed and the local electric company said that it was safe. In the weeks before Christmas that year, George's older sons also noticed a strange car parked along the main highway through town with the occupants watching the younger Sodder children as they returned from school. So, anyway, the Sodders celebrated Christmas Eve 1945. Marion, the oldest daughter, was working at a dime store in downtown Fayetteville and she surprised 3 of her younger sisters, 12-year-old Martha, 8-year-old Jenny and 5-year-old Betty, with new toys that she bought for them as gifts. The younger children were so excited about these gifts that they asked their mother if they could stay up a bit longer past their usual bedtime. Considering that, it was Christmas Eve, at 10 p.m, Jenny, the mother, told them that yes, they could, as long as the oldest boys, who were still awake, 14-year-old Maurice and his 9-year-old brother Louis remembered to put the cows in and feed the chickens before going to bed themselves. George and the two oldest boys, 23-year-old John and 16-year-old George Jr., who spent the day working with their father, were already fast asleep. After reminding the children of their chores, Jenny, the mom, took 2-year-old Sylvia upstairs with her and they went to bed together. But then the phone started ringing at 12:30 in the night. Jenny woke up and went to answer the phone. The caller seemed to be a woman whose voice Jenny just didn't recognize. This woman was asking for a name that Jenny again wasn't familiar with, and she could also hear the sound of laughter and clinking glasses in the background of this call. Jenny told the caller that she reached a wrong number, later remembering this woman's weird laugh. Jenny, then just hung up the phone and she went back to bed. As she did so, she noticed that the lights were still on and the curtains were not drawn. Two things that the children would normally take care of when they stayed up later than their parents. Marian fell asleep in the living room on the couch, so Jenny assumed that the other children who stayed up later went back up to the attic where they slept. So, she closed the curtains, turned out the lights and returned to bed. At 1 a.m., at 1 in the night, Jenny is again woken up, this time by the sound of an object hitting the house's roof with a loud bang, then a rolling noise. After hearing nothing else, she again goes back to sleep. Half an hour later, she wakes up yet again, but this time she smells smoke. When she got up again, she found that the room George, her husband, used for his office was actually on fire around the phone line and the fuse box. So Jenny woke him up and he in turn woke his older sons up. Both parents and 4 of their children, Marian, Sylvia, John and George Jr., managed to escape the house. They frantically screamed for the other children upstairs in the attic, but they heard no response. They couldn't go up there because the stairway itself was already on fire, so there was no way that they could reach the top of the house, the attic room, from the inside. John said in his first police interview after the fire that he went up to the attic to alert his siblings sleeping there, but he later changed his story to say that he only called up there and didn't actually see the children. Even attempts to find help and rescue the children were just so strangely complicated. The phone didn't work, so Marian had to go to a neighbor's house to call the fire department. A driver on the nearby road also saw the flames and called from a nearby tavern. They as well were unsuccessful because either they couldn't reach the operator or because the phone there turned out to be broken. One of them was eventually successful in actually reaching the fire department from another phone in the center of town. George, the father, in the meantime, barefoot, climbed the wall and broke open an attic window, cutting his arm in the process. He was trying to get the rest of the children out of the house. He and his sons wanted to use a ladder to the attic to rescue the children, but strangely, the ladder wasn't in its usual spot, resting against the house, and couldn't be found anywhere nearby. A water barrel that could have been used to extinguish the fire was frozen solid. George then tried to pull both of the trucks he used in his business up to the house and used these trucks instead to climb to the attic window, but neither of the trucks would start, even though these trucks, they worked perfectly during the previous day. Frustrated and upset, the 6 Sodders who escaped had no choice but to watch the house burn down and collapse over the next 45 minutes. They assumed that the other 5 children died in the fire. The fire department, low on manpower because of the war and relying on individual firefighters to call each other, didn't respond until later the following morning. Chief F.J. Morris said the next day that the already slow response was further hampered by his inability to drive the fire truck, requiring that he wait until someone who could drive was available. The firefighters, one of whom was a brother of Jenny's, could do little but look through the ashes that were left in the Sodder's basement. By 10 a.m., Chief Morris told the Sodders that they didn't find any bones, as might have been expected if the other children were in the house when the house burned down. According to another account, they did find a few bone fragments and internal organs, but they chose not to tell the family. It was also noted by modern fire professionals that their search was superficial at best. Chief Morris believed that the 5 children died in the fire, suggesting the fire was hot enough to burn their bodies completely. Chief Morris told George to leave the site undisturbed so that the State Fire Marshal's office could conduct a more thorough investigation. However, after 4 days, George and his wife, they just couldn't bear the site anymore, so George bulldozed 5 feet or 1.5 meters of dirt over the site with the intention of converting it into a memorial garden for their lost children. The local coroner convened an inquest the next day which held that the fire was an accident caused by faulty wiring. Among the jurors for this inquest was the man who threatened George that his house would be burned down and his children destroyed in retribution for his anti-Mussolini remarks. Death certificates for the 5 children were issued on December 30th. The local newspaper contradicted itself, stating that all the bodies had been found, but then later in the same story reporting that only part of one body was recovered. George and Jenny were too grief-stricken to attend the funeral on 2nd of January 1946, although their surviving children did attend it. Not long afterwards, as they somehow began to rebuild their lives, the Sodders started to question all of the official findings about this fire. They were wondering why, if the fire was caused by an electrical problem, the family's Christmas lights stayed on throughout the fire's early stages when the power should have gone out. Which is, a justified question really. Remember the ladder missing from the house? Well, they also found a ladder at the bottom of an embankment 75 feet or 23 meters away from the house. A phone repairman told the Sodders that the house's phone line didn't burn through in the fire as they first believed, but it was in fact cut by someone who was willing and who was also able to climb 14 feet or 4.3 meters up the pole and reach 2 feet 61 centimeters away from it to do so. A man, which the neighbors saw stealing a block and tackle from the property around the time of the fire, was identified and later arrested. He admitted to the theft and claimed that he was the one who cut the phone line, thinking it was a power line, but he denied having anything to do with the fire. So, kind of a lot of things just didn't make sense. But there is no record identifying that this suspect actually exists and why he would have wanted to cut any utility lines to the Sodder house while stealing the block and tackle. And this was never explained. Jenny said in 1968 that if he would have cut the power line, she and her husband, along with their other 4 children, would never have been able to make it out of the house. Jenny also had trouble accepting Chief Morris's belief that all traces of the children's bodies had been burned completely in the fire. Many of the household appliances were found still recognizable in the ash, along with fragments of the tin roof. She compared the results of the fire with a newspaper article of a similar house fire that she read about around the same time that actually killed a family of 7. Skeletal remains of all the victims were reported to have been found in that case. Jenny even burned small piles of animal bones just to see if they would be completely consumed, but none ever were. An employee of a local crematorium that she contacted told her that human bones remain even after bodies are burned at 2000 degrees Fahrenheit or 1090 degrees Celsius for 2 hours, far longer and hotter than the house fire could have been. The Sodder's truck's failure to start was also considered. George believed that they were tampered with, perhaps by the same man who stole the block and tackle and cut the phone line. However, one of his sons-in-law told the Charleston Gazette-Mail in 2013 that he believed Sodder and his sons might have, in their rush to start the trucks, flooded the engines. Some accounts also suggested that the wrong number phone call to the Sodder house might have also somehow been connected to the fire and the disappearance of the children. However, investigators later found the woman who made the call, and she confirmed that indeed it was a wrong number on her part. As spring came, the Sodders, as they had said that they would, planted flowers in the soil bulldozed over the house. Jenny tended it carefully for the rest of her life. But further developments in early 1946 reinforced the family's belief that the children they were remembering might actually be alive somewhere. Evidence came to light which supported their belief that the fire didn't start because of the electrical fault but was instead set deliberately. The driver of a bus which passed through Fayetteville late Christmas Eve said that he saw some people throwing balls of fire at the house. A few months later, when the snow melted, Sylvia, one of the children, found a small, hard, dark green rubber ball-like object in the bush nearby. George, who remembered his wife's account of a loud thump on the roof before the fire, said that this looked like a pineapple bomb, a hand grenade, or some other incendiary device used in combat. The family later claimed that, contrary to the fire marshal's conclusion, the fire had started on the roof, although by then there was absolutely no way to prove it. Other witnesses claimed to have seen the other children themselves. One woman who had been watching the fire from the road said that she saw some of them looking out of a passing car while the house was burning. Another woman at a rest stop between Fayetteville and Charleston said that she served them breakfast the next morning and remembered the presence of a car with Florida license plates in the rest stop's parking lot as well. The Sodder family eventually hired a private investigator called C.C. Tinsley from the nearby town of Golly Bridge to look into the case. The PI learned that the insurance salesman who threatened the family with a fire a year before over George's anti-Mussolini sentiments had been on the coroner's jury that ruled the fire an accident, and he told the Sodders this. He also learned of rumors around Fayetteville that even though his report to the Sodders that no remains had been found in the ashes, Chief Morris actually found a heart which he later packed into a metal box and secretly buried. Chief Morris had apparently confessed this to a local minister who confirmed it to George. George and P.I. Tinsley went to Chief Morris and confronted him with the news. Chief Morris agreed to show the two where he buried the metal box, and they dug it up. They took what they found inside the box to a local funeral director who, after examining it, told them that it was in reality fresh beef liver which was never exposed to fire. Later, rumors circulated around Fayetteville that Chief Morris had afterwards admitted the box with the liver didn't come from the fire originally. He placed it there hoping that the Sodders would find it and just be satisfied that the missing children had indeed died in the fire. George didn't wait for reports of sightings to come in. Sometimes he made them himself. After seeing a girl in a magazine picture of young ballet dancers in New York City who looked like one of his missing daughters, Betty, he drove all the way to the girl's school where his repeated demands to see the girl himself were refused. He also tried to interest the FBI in investigating what he considered a kidnapping. Director J. Edgar Hoover personally responded to his letters saying, "Although I would like to be of service, the matter related appears to be of local character and does not come within the investigative jurisdiction of this bureau. If the local authorities requested the bureau's assistance," he added, he would of course direct agents to assist, but the Fayetteville police and fire departments declined to do so. In August 1949, George was able to persuade Oscar Hunter, a Washington, D.C. pathologist, to supervise a new search through the dirt at the house site. After a very thorough search, artifacts, including a dictionary that belonged to the children and some coins, were found. Several small bone fragments were also found, determined to have been human vertebrae. The bone fragments were then sent to Marshall T. Newman, a specialist at the Smithsonian Institution. They were confirmed to be lumbar vertebrae, all from the same person. Newman's report said, quote, "Since the transverse recesses are fused, the age of this individual at death should have been 16 to 17 years. The top limit of age should be about 22, since the centra, which normally fuse at 23, are still unfused. Thus, given this age range, it was not very likely that these bones were from any of the 5 missing children, since the oldest, Maurice, had been 14 at the time." Newman added that the bone showed no sign of exposure to any flame. He also agreed that it was very strange those bones were the only ones found, since a wood fire of such short duration should have left full skeletons of all of the children behind. The report concluded that the vertebrae had instead most likely come from the dirt that George bulldozed over the site. Later, P.I. Tinsley confirmed that the bone fragments came from a cemetery in nearby Mount Hope, but couldn't explain why they were taken from there or how they came to be at the fire site. The Smithsonian Institute returned the bone fragments to George in September 1949, according to records. However, their current location is unknown. The investigation into the Sodder children and its findings drew national attention, and the West Virginia legislature held 2 hearings on the case in 1950. However, Governor Okiel Petson and State Police Superintendent W.E. Burchett told the Sodders that the case was hopeless and closed it at the state level. The FBI then decided it had jurisdiction as a possible interstate kidnapping, but they dropped the case after 2 years of following leads which led nowhere. But the Sodders didn't give up hope. They had flyers printed up with pictures of the children, offering a $5,000 reward for information that would settle the case for at least one of the children. In 1952, they put up a billboard at the site of the house and another along US Route 60 near Ansted with the same information. It would in time become a landmark for traffic through Fayetteville on US Route 19, known today as State Route 16. The family's efforts brought another reported sighting of the children after the fire. Ida Crutchfield, a woman who ran a Charleston hotel, claimed that she saw the children approximately 1 week after the fire, not remembering the exact date. The children came in around midnight with 2 men and 2 women, all of whom appeared to her to be of Italian extraction. When she tried to speak with the children, one of the men looked at her in a hostile manner. He then turned around and began talking rapidly in Italian. Immediately after, everybody stopped talking to her. She remembered that they left the hotel early the next morning. But today, investigators don't consider her story credible, as she had only first seen photos of the children 2 years after the fire, 5 years before she came forward. George, the father, followed up leads in person, traveling to the areas of the tips. A woman from St. Louis, Missouri claimed that Martha, one of the children, was being held in a convent there. A bar patron in Texas claimed to have overheard two other people making incriminating statements about a fire that happened on Christmas Eve in West Virginia a few years before. None of this proved significant though. When George heard later that a relative of Jenny's in Florida had children which looked similar to his children, the relative actually had to prove that the children were his own before George was satisfied. In 1967, George went to the Houston area to investigate another tip. A woman there wrote to the family saying that Louis revealed his true identity to her one night after having too much to drink. She believed that he and Maurice were both living in Texas somewhere. But George and his son-in-law Grover Paxton were unable to speak with her. Police there did help them to find the two men the woman mentioned, but they denied being the missing sons. Grover Paxton said years later that doubts about that denial lingered in George's mind for the rest of his life. Another letter that they received that year brought the Sodders what they believe was the most credible evidence that at least Louis was still alive. One day, Jenny found in the mail a letter addressed to her, postmarked in Central City, Kentucky, with no return address on it. Inside, there was a picture of a young man around 30 years old with features strongly resembling Louis's, who would have been in his 30s if he had survived the fire. On the back of the photo was written, Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, Elil boys, A90132 or 35. After this letter, the Sodder family hired another private detective to go to Central City and look into this. But he never reported back to the Sodders and they were unable to find him afterwards. The picture, however, gave them fresh hope. And from some reports that I read, it's believed that the second private detective actually scammed them. So the Sodders, they added the boy's picture to the billboard, leaving Central City out of it and any other published information out of fear that Louis might come to harm. They also put an enlargement of the photo over their fireplace. George admitted to the Charleston Gazette-Mail late the next year that the lack of information was like hitting a rock wall. We can't go any further. But he vowed to continue. Time is running out for us, he admitted in another interview around that time. But we only want to know. If they did die in the fire, we want to be convinced. Otherwise, we want to know what happened to them. Sadly, George Sodder died in 1969. Jenny and her surviving children, except for John, who never talked about the night of the fire, only to say that the family should accept it and get on with their lives, continued to seek answers to their questions about the missing children's fate. After George's death, Jenny stayed in the family home, putting up fencing around it and adding additional rooms. For the rest of her life, Jenny wore black in mourning and she tended the garden at the site of the former house. After her death in 1989, the family finally took the weather-worn billboard down. The surviving Sodder children, joined by their own children, continue to publicize the case and investigate leads. They, along with older Fayetteville residents, theorized that the Sicilian mafia was trying to extort money from George and the children may have been taken by someone who knew about the planned arson and said that they would be safe if they left the house. They were possibly taken back to Italy. If the children survived all those years and were aware that their parents and siblings survived as well, the family believes they may have avoided contact in order to keep them away from harm. Sylvia Sodder Paxton, the youngest in the family, died in 2021. She was in the house on the night of the fire, which she said was her earliest memory. I was the last one of the kids to leave home, she recalled to the Gazette-Mail in 2013. She and her father often stayed up late talking about what might have happened. I experienced their grief for a long time. She believed that her siblings survived that night and helped with efforts to find them and publicize the case. Her daughter said in 2006, she promised my grandparents she wouldn't let the story die, that she would do everything she could. In the 21st century, these efforts came to include online forums like websleuths.com, in addition to media coverage. The increase in the coverage led some who have examined the case to believe that the children did in fact die in 1945. George Bragg, a local author who wrote about the case in his 2012 book West Virginia's Unsolved Murders, believes that John was telling the truth in his original account when he said he tried to physically wake his siblings up before fleeing the house. He said, "Logic tells you they probably did burn up in the fire, but you can't always go by logic." Stacey Horn, who did a segment on the case for National Public Radio around its 60th anniversary in 2005, also believes that the children's death in the fire is the most plausible solution. In a post on her blog with material she had to cut from her story for Time, she noted that the fire continued to smolder all night after the house collapsed, and that 2 hours was not enough time to search the ash thoroughly. Even if it had been, the firefighters may not have known what to look for. However, she said there is enough genuine weirdness about this whole thing that if someday it is learned that the children did not die in the fire, I won't be shocked. During the fire, George, Jenny, and 4 of the 9 children escaped. The oldest son was away in the army at the time. The bodies of the other 5 children have never been found. The Sodders believe for the rest of their lives that the 5 missing children survived. The Sodders never rebuilt the house. Instead, they converted the site into a memorial garden to their lost children. In the 1950s, as they came to doubt that the children died, they put up the billboard at the site along State Route 16 with pictures of the 5 children, offering a reward for information that would bring closure to the case. The billboard remained up until shortly after Jenny Sodder's death in 1989. In support of their belief that the children survived, the Sodders pointed to a number of unusual circumstances before and during the fire. George disputed the fire department's finding that the blaze was electrical in origin, pointing out that he recently had the house rewired and inspected. He and his wife suspected arson, leading to theories that the children had been taken by the Sicilian mafia, perhaps in retaliation for George's criticism of Benito Mussolini and the fascist government of his native Italy. State and federal efforts to investigate the case further in the early 1950s brought no new information. The family did, however, later receive what may have been a picture of one of the boys as an adult during the 60s. The last surviving sister, along with the Sodder grandchildren, continued to publicize the case in the 21st century in the media and online. If I'm honest with you, personally, I'm a bit divided on this case. On one hand, I don't see how the 5 children could have been taken without anyone in the house hearing them, but then if you think about it, they were in the attic, so it's possible not to be heard. I'm not sure, but needless to say, there are a lot of things which just don't make sense and kind of point to this being planned. The sound that Jenny heard of something rolling on the roof, then the ladder was missing and found later, the phone line was cut, the trucks didn't start, nobody around was able to call the fire department. Also, the way it was then, they had a system which is not like the one we have today, where firefighters, they had to call each other to attend the fire, rather than how it is now, where a caller calls the central system and firefighters are dispatched. With this in mind, it is possible that if it was planned, whoever was involved knew how it worked with the firefighters. It's also possible that the phone call the Sodders received at midnight from the woman was only maybe to verify who was where in the house. Then you also have someone watching the youngest children coming home from school, and the most important thing, they found no bones whatsoever, no evidence that there were human bodies burnt. I don't know, but it seems like there are just too many coincidences to just be a coincidence. I don't know, you guys. You let me know what do you think in the comment section down below. For now, thank you so much for watching. Take care, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!